Okay, so am I the only one that's a little tired of seeing celebrities in quarantine send out their in this together hashtags while they sit in their jacuzzis and private basketball courts? I mean, great for them. I don't begrudge them their success or their crazy cool houses. I just don't feel very in this together with them when I literally have two kids draped off me while I work and the other two off doing who knows what in our very noticeably jacuzzi-less house. COVID-19 is drastically different for some people than it is for others. And frankly, I don't think I really have it that bad. I haven't lost anyone that I love, and I'm not even sure that anyone in our circle of friends has even had it. So for me, this isn't really a tragedy personally, at least not yet, but there are lots of people who are feeling the suffering. Lots of people for whom it actually is a tragedy. Maybe that's you. Maybe you've lost your job because of this. Maybe you've lost a loved one. Maybe you're feeling a deepening despair over how helpless everybody feels in the middle of quarantine. Maybe you're terrified of this whole situation wiping out your retirement savings, or maybe you're one of the millions of people that have missed a mortgage payment here in April and you're scared of losing your home. There's endless ways that this quarantine could be a tragedy for you and your family. And you might be feeling a bit overwhelmed, or maybe just sad, or even angry with God over this whole thing. What do you do with those feelings? I mean, as a culture, Americans are really great at rallying to a cause and overcoming obstacles. It's part of our DNA to make good out of bad. And so we've heard a lot about how we can use this situation for good, supporting one another and, of course, supporting the nurses and the doctors and essential personnel who are on the front lines. We're focusing on what's really important in life more right now than maybe we ever have. It's kind of just who we are as Americans, to be positive and to fight for each other. But you know what we're not so good at? Maybe even, I might say, bad at? We're pretty bad at knowing how to handle suffering, tragedy, even mourning. Knowing what to do with the pain that we're experiencing, we're not so great at that. So as a culture, we tend to numb it or ignore it until it becomes debilitating. This is something we as a culture, especially if you're a Christian, we need to learn to face. And I think one skill that Christians in America could certainly use right now while we sit in quarantine is the biblical practice of lament. It's the act of pouring out your emotions to God, crying out to Him in honest pain, expressing sorrow for our broken, quarantined world and our grief over the pain that we might be experiencing, whether the tragedy is huge for you or if it's little for you. You see, there's value in lament that I think us Western Christians could really use right now. So here's what I would like to do to help. Over the next several video studies here, I want to teach you some of what I've learned about the value of lamenting from the Bible, specifically from the book of Lamenting. Ironically enough, it's called Lamentations. There's Psalms and other places you could also turn to, but I would like to look at Lamentations for a bit. Unsurprisingly, we are not the first nation to face a tragedy on a huge national scale. Around 2,600 years ago, an ancient civilization, the Jews of the southern kingdom of Israel, faced a tragedy that drove them to lament too. See, the world superpowers at the time, Babylon and Egypt, were at war, and the little kingdom of Israel was kind of stuck right in between, caught in the crossfire, as it were, of a world war before they started numbering them. King Zedekiah was the king of Jerusalem and Israel. But he really wasn't in charge of much. Israel at that time, or the kingdom of Judah, was under the authority of the king of Babylon. And when the king Zedekiah tried to switch sides to change his alliance to Egypt, well, the king of Babylon didn't take that very well. And so he came down with his army. He laid siege to Jerusalem for 18 months before destroying it completely. For the year and a half that Jerusalem was under siege, the people starved. Many died from that. Many died from disease or even the looting during those 18 months. People even resorted to cannibalism. That's how bad it got. Until finally, Babylon broke down Jerusalem's walls. Then they burned the whole city to the ground. They stole every single item of any value. And maybe the worst, at least for the Jews, maybe the worst thing was the Babylonians pillaged and destroyed the temple, the place where God was supposed to live, the symbol that God was actually with them. The Babylonians took everything. All the religious items that they used for worship, even the gold in the temple, on the walls in the temple, everything. And then they razed the whole thing to the ground. They scattered the stones. King Zedekiah, they took him and they had his sons slaughtered right there in front of him. And then they gouged out his eyes. And they dragged him and all the rest of the people off to be slaves in Babylon. Now that's a tragedy, right? It's there in the rubble and the smoke that the book of Lamenting was written. And it begins with this powerful word in Hebrew. It's aha. How? It even sounds like this guttural thing. It's not even a question. It's just a cry of pain. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. Now look what she's become. Do you ever ask those types of questions late at night when you're in quarantine? How? How could this happen, God? How could you allow this? I feel so helpless and frustrated. What a waste everything has become. For me, for our nation, for the whole world. It's all broken, God. Now, if you're a Christian of a certain age, or any age, frankly, these types of questions might strike your ear as sounding a bit wrong. Like you shouldn't even ask them. Like we're just supposed to say, God is in control, and shove our grief deep down where it won't bother us for a few more days. You might think it's even blasphemous to ask questions of God like this. Like you're blaming him. But here's the thing. Lamenting like that, asking those types of questions and pouring out your heart and your anguish in that kind of way. Lamenting is in the Bible. We're taught and encouraged to do it by God himself, as the lamenting is supposed to be part of your Christian walk with God. Like this is a part of what the Christian experience is. What it means to walk in communion with God is to share that with him. Lamentations has 5 chapters. Each one is an individual poem, a series, 5 in a row, of cries to God that ask some of the hardest questions that you can imagine. And here's the thing. God doesn't necessarily set our minds at ease about every single question, but he certainly encourages us to ask them, to be honest with him. You see, he wants to hear your heartache in the midst of your tragedy, whatever it is. That's what lamenting is about. One of my favorite teachers once told me that to the Western mind, the way that we here in the West tend to think, when pain hits us, we tend to default to asking, is there really a God? Is God really there? Does he exist? But for the Hebrew, the Jew who wrote Lamentations, instead of asking, is God there? When pain hits us, when it hits him, he asks, God, where are you? Come save us. You see the difference? That's lamenting. God, where are you? Come and save us. I find it helpful to understand lamenting a little bit better, the practice of lamenting a little bit better, by remembering that Lamentations is a series of 5 separate poems, too. Like, they're individual poems. That's helpful to me. I'm really bad at poetry. Everything I try to write, ever since I was a teenager, all my poems seem to want to end happy. Probably because I have this tendency to get kind of preachy in my poetry, even if I'm just supposed to be, kind of preaching to myself. But poetry, by its very nature, is an unresolved exploration of a topic. It might make you feel something. It may even make you feel better, but poetry has no goal other than to describe and evoke certain emotions out of us. It's kind of the perfect genre for lamenting. And as we read Lamentations, we need to remember that. But the reason it's encouraging to me is because when I lament, when I pour out my heart to God, these poems remind me that there may not be a resolution, but there is a connection. God hears, and in his deep love, he is moving in and through the cries of his children's pain. So this is my encouragement to you today. As Christians here in America, stuck in quarantine, if you're feeling that the positivity, the encouragement, the desire to use this as something useful is good, but not all that you're experiencing, maybe with me, you might want to learn to lament the pain that you're experiencing as well. So let's try. Let's try pouring our heartache about the suffering that we're all experiencing out to God. You see, if there has ever been someone who was really #in this together with you, it's him. And he wants to hear from you. So over the next few weeks, join me as we study together from the book of Lamenting. In the next couple of weeks, we're going to learn some of the themes that work their way through Lamentations. And in the next video, what I'd like to do is I want to share with you kind of a primer. Like, how do you actually do it? What do you do in order to sit down and lament? What does it look like? Please like, comment, share, especially comment if you have any thoughts or questions. I'd love to interact with you more about all of this. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to seeing you again. Shalom.